Picking up where we left off, we're going to finish up the arteries and then move into capillaries for this video. So I left off without talking about the arterial sense organs, but they're actually pretty impressive, so we will add them onto this video. There are some sensory structures in certain walls of arteries that monitor the blood pressure and the chemistry of the blood, which if you think about that is pretty darn impressive. So I wanted to include a little bit about them. They transmit that information to the brainstem, which is where the heart rate is regulated, and then respiration is regulated as well. So the first one are called carotid sinuses, and they are baroreceptors, which is sensing the amount of blood pressure. They are in the walls of the internal carotid artery, and again, they monitor blood pressure and send those signals to the brainstem. The second type are called carotid bodies, and they are chemoreceptors, and so they're basically oval bodies, and they're in the branch of the common carotids, and they are monitoring the blood chemistry. So they transmit signals to the brainstem respiratory centers to help adjust the respiratory rate to make sure that the pH levels, carbon dioxide, and oxygen levels are perfect. And then the third type are called aortic bodies. They are also chemoreceptors, except instead of being in the common carotids, they are in the walls of the aortic arch, but they also are chemistry receptors sending that information to the brainstem. Okay, on to capillaries. The capillary section in your textbook is very clear about the importance of the capillaries, and in my opinion, this is probably the most important part of this chapter, and it gets overlooked quite a bit. So here we go. The capillaries are the exchange vessels. Your book calls them the business end of the cardiovascular system, but the way I think about it, they're kind of the worker bees. They are actually doing the gas exchange to all of the body tissues throughout the body. So in a capillary, the nutrients and wastes and hormones are able to pass through the walls of the capillaries, and so they are transporting or dropping off from the blood, and the tissues are receiving what they need, and then vice versa. So they are composed of a layer of endothelium and then also a basal lamina layer. They are not very apparent in tendons, ligaments in our skin, the cornea, or the lens of the eye. But they are everywhere else, and they are broken up into three types, and they're distinguished by how easy it is for substances to pass through, and then also their structural differences. We'll talk about different layers in each one, but I think probably it's going to be easier to remember them by which substances can pass through, easier than the different layers. So the most common type are called continuous capillaries. They are made of endothelial cells, and they have tight junctions forming a tube. Then they have intercellular clefts in between the cells. They are allowing passage of all small solutes, including glucose. They also have cells called pericytes that wrap around the capillaries. These pericytes are very helpful because they have the same protein that can contract like muscle cells. So those pericytes help contract and relax to regulate the blood flow through the capillary. And they can also differentiate later into endothelial cells or smooth muscle cells. The second type of capillary is called fenestrated capillaries. These are found in kidneys and in the small intestines. And these are more helpful in areas that need a rapid absorption or filtration. So they're made of endothelial cells that have these small holes called filtration pores, also called fenestrations. And so in these areas where we need rapid absorption or filtration, this type of capillary is essential because they have these pores. They also have a thin glycoprotein layer, which is almost thinner than a normal cell membrane, and this allows passage of only very small molecules. The third type are called sinusoids or discontinuous capillaries, and we see these in the liver or bone marrow or spleen. They're kind of irregular, bigger spaces with larger pores, and they allow blood proteins, clotting factors, and new blood cells to enter the circulation. This is a close-up picture of what the most common type looks like, the continuous capillary. So on the top, that's that parasite, that cell that's able to contract. And then you can see the very thin endothelial cell. There's actually two of them, and you can see the little tight junction that basically form the tube of the capillary. And in the book, it talks about that the smallest capillaries, even the red blood cells need to kind of squeeze through because that's how tiny they are. And then there's the fenestrated capillaries with all of the pores that you can see. And then this shows the sinusoid in the liver, where it's not a thin little tube like we're used to thinking, but it's more of an irregular area where new blood cells can be released into the bloodstream, or clotting proteins can also be released into the bloodstream. Okay, capillaries are usually not just all by themselves. They're organized into networks called capillary beds. We talked about the different types of arteries, and when we got down to the smallest type of artery, we were talking about them being called a meta-arterial. And so a meta-arterial is supplying the capillary beds with the blood. And then there is a thoroughfare channel, which is the part of the meta-arterial that continues through the capillary bed to the venule. So if the capillary beds are basically closed off, then the blood will stay in the meta-arterial and move through the thoroughfare channel through the venule. We talked about in the artery section that there are these little controls that are called precapillary sphincters, and they are open or closed. If they are open, then the capillary beds are able to receive blood. They get blood and go through the process of exchange with the tissues around them. But when those sphincters are closed, blood bypasses the capillaries, and it goes through the thoroughfare channel to a venule and on to a different area. 3/4 of the body's capillaries are shut down at any given time. Talked about that during certain activities, certain capillary beds are open and then closed at rest. Okay, and there's a picture. I think we saw that on the artery video, but there it is again. So it kind of showcases that if the capillary bed were closed, that the blood would just go through that meta-arterial, that thoroughfare channel, or if they're open, it would spread through that network. Now, really, any blood or any cell or tissue in our body is only 4 to 6 cells away from a capillary. So this network, on all of these pictures, it just looks like one little area, but really this is every part of your body has these capillary beds. And this is how all of the nutrients that the blood is bringing is reaching every tissue. Okay, this is a picture of what would happen if the sphincters are closed. This happens in your skeletal muscles when we are at rest.